The morning of Veronica's wedding began with rain, a cold November drizzle that painted the windows of the Whitfield mansion in streaks of grey and silver, creating patterns that Natalie traced with her fingertip as she sat alone in her small room on the third floor, the room that had once been a servant's quarters back when the house was built in 1892, before it was renovated and modernized, but still maintained its original charm and grandeur. She had been awake since 4 in the morning, unable to sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of what the day would bring, wondering if perhaps this time, on this special day, things might be different. That maybe Veronica would look at her the way sisters are supposed to look at each other, with warmth and affection, rather than the cold indifference that had characterized their relationship for the past decade. The dress hanging on the back of her door was beige, a color that Eleanor Whitfield had specifically chosen for her, explaining in that clipped, businesslike tone she always used when addressing Natalie that it was appropriate and wouldn't draw attention, which Natalie understood to mean that she should blend into the background, become invisible, disappear into the wallpaper of Veronica's perfect day. She had bought the dress herself with money she'd saved from her part-time job at the community college library, where she worked 20 hours a week shelving books and helping students find research materials, a job that paid minimum wage but gave her something that money couldn't buy, a place where she felt useful, where people smiled at her genuinely, where her missing left arm didn't define her entire existence. The dress had cost $47 at a discount department store, and she'd chosen the beige because that's what Eleanor had demanded, even though when she'd tried it on in the fluorescent-lit fitting room, she'd looked at her reflection and felt like she was disappearing, fading away into nothingness, becoming exactly what the Whitfields had always wanted her to be, present but not visible, there but not really there, a ghost haunting the edges of their perfect family portrait. As she dressed that morning, her fingers fumbling with the zipper that ran down the back, struggling as she always did with tasks that required 2 hands, she thought about her real mother, the woman whose face she could barely remember now. Just fragments of memory. Warm brown eyes, the smell of vanilla and cinnamon, a laugh that sounded like music, hands that had braided her hair every morning before school, gentle hands that had never made her feel like she was less than whole. That mother had died 12 years ago in the same car accident that had taken her father and her left arm, the accident that had happened on a rainy Tuesday evening when they were driving home from her 10th birthday dinner at her favorite Italian restaurant, the accident that the police report said was caused by a drunk driver running a red light, the accident that had left her alone in a hospital bed for 3 months, learning to live with phantom pains and the strange sensation of reaching for things with an arm that no longer existed. The Whitfields had adopted her 6 months after the accident, and at first, when she was still 12 and traumatized and desperate for any kind of family, she had believed their kindness was real, had believed that Harold's hand on her shoulder during the adoption ceremony meant something genuine, had believed that Eleanor's tears were for her and not for the cameras that were there to document one of Boston's most prominent families opening their hearts to tragedy. She had believed, for almost a full year, that Veronica's polite smiles and carefully measured words would eventually transform into real sisterhood, that the ice would melt, that she would finally have a family again. But belief, she had learned, was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the small cruelties that accumulated day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. The separate dinner times, the different set of rules, the introduction at parties as the girl we're helping, rather than our daughter, the separate bedrooms on different floors, the birthday gifts that came from obligation rather than love, the Christmas mornings where Veronica opened dozens of carefully wrapped presents while Natalie received practical items like underwear and school supplies, the college application process where Veronica had her pick of Ivy League schools, while Natalie was directed toward the local community college because it's more practical given your limitations. The beige dress felt like a uniform that morning, like the clothes that servants wore in old movies, designed to make her disappear into the background, and as she looked at herself in the small mirror above her dresser, she barely recognized the young woman staring back at her. 22 years old but looking somehow both younger and older at the same time, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail because Eleanor had specifically instructed her not to wear it down. "We don't want you looking like you're trying too hard, dear." Her face free of makeup, except for a touch of lip gloss because cosmetics were unnecessary for someone in your position. Her right hand smoothing down the wrinkles in the cheap fabric, while her left side remained empty, a constant reminder of everything she'd lost and everything she would never have. The rain continued to fall outside her window, and she wondered if perhaps it was an omen, a sign that this day would be just another in a long series of days where she existed on the margins of the Whitfield family, close enough to observe their happiness, but never close enough to truly be part of it. The Whitfield mansion, a sprawling estate in the affluent Boston suburb of Brookline, had been decorated for weeks in preparation for Veronica's wedding, and Natalie had watched the transformation from her third-floor window, observing as teams of decorators arrived daily with truckloads of white roses, peonies, and orchids, as electricians strung thousands of tiny lights through the gardens, as caterers delivered equipment for the reception that would host 300 guests, as a massive white tent was erected on the back lawn complete with crystal chandeliers and a stage for the 12-piece orchestra that would play during dinner. The cost of the wedding, she had overheard Eleanor telling someone on the phone, was approaching $500,000, a sum that was so astronomical to Natalie that she couldn't even properly comprehend it, couldn't fathom spending on one day what would take her 20 years to earn at her library job, couldn't understand how a single event could cost more than most people spent on their entire education or their first house. But the Whitfields had always lived in a different world than Natalie, a world where money flowed like water, where price tags were irrelevant, where the cost of things was measured not in dollars, but in status and appearance and what other people would think. Harold Whitfield had made his fortune in manufacturing, inheriting his father's company and expanding it into an empire that employed thousands of people across New England until the recession hit and profit margins shrank and shareholders demanded cuts. And Harold had made the decision that had defined his public image for years afterward, laying off 300 workers right before Christmas, families who had worked for the company for generations suddenly finding themselves without income or health insurance or hope. The backlash had been immediate and brutal, with protests outside the corporate headquarters, with news stories about families losing their homes, with Harold's name becoming synonymous with corporate greed and callousness, with the company's stock price plummeting as consumers threatened boycotts and investors pulled their money out. That's when Harold's public relations team had suggested something radical, something that would change Natalie's life forever. What if the heartless CEO who had destroyed 300 families at Christmas showed his human side by adopting a disabled orphan, by opening his home and his heart to a child who had lost everything, by demonstrating that despite his business decisions, he was fundamentally a good man who cared about those less fortunate. The timing had been perfect, almost too perfect, with Natalie's case making headlines just as Harold needed to rehabilitate his image. A 12-year-old girl lying in a hospital bed with no family and no prospects and a missing arm. A perfect symbol of tragedy and hope that could be photographed and publicized and leveraged to show that Harold Whitfield wasn't a monster, but a philanthropist, a man with a conscience, a man who understood suffering because he had welcomed it into his own home. The adoption had been covered by every major newspaper in Boston, with photographers capturing the moment Harold signed the papers, with interviews where Eleanor spoke tearfully about their decision to expand their family, with Veronica standing beside them, looking angelic in her private school uniform, the picture of an older sister ready to welcome a new sibling with open arms. The company's stock had recovered within 6 months, the protests had died down, and Harold's reputation had been largely restored, the layoffs receding into the background noise of business as usual, while the story of his adoption of a disabled orphan continued to generate positive press for years afterward. Natalie had been too young and too traumatized to understand what was happening at first, had genuinely believed that she was being given a second chance at family, had thrown herself into trying to be the perfect daughter, studying hard and staying quiet and never complaining and always being grateful, because she thought that was what they wanted, that was what would make them love her. But she had slowly realized, through 1,000 small moments of exclusion and dismissal, that her role in the family was not to be loved, but to be useful, not to be a daughter, but to be a symbol, not to be seen as a person, but as a prop in the ongoing performance of the Whitfield family's generosity and magnanimity. She had learned not to expect birthday parties or family vacations or goodnight kisses or any of the small intimacies that made a family real, had learned instead to be content with having a roof over her head and food in her stomach and the knowledge that she was serving a purpose, even if that purpose had nothing to do with her actual humanity and everything to do with how her presence made the Whitfields look to the outside world. The wedding preparations had been particularly difficult, with Natalie relegated to the role of spectator, watching as Veronica tried on dress after dress at exclusive boutiques where Natalie wasn't invited, hearing about bachelorette parties in New York and Miami that she wasn't included in, listening to Eleanor discuss seating arrangements and menu selections and flower choices without once asking for her input or opinion. She had tried not to care, had tried to tell herself that it was Veronica's day and she shouldn't expect to be part of the planning, but there was a part of her, a small, stubborn part that refused to completely die, no matter how many times it was wounded, that wondered why having a sister couldn't mean something more than this, couldn't mean shared secrets and late-night conversations and someone who knew your fears and dreams and loved you anyway. But Veronica had never been that kind of sister, had always maintained a careful distance, treating Natalie with polite indifference rather than cruelty, but never with warmth or genuine affection, as if Natalie was a housiguest who had overstayed her welcome rather than someone who shared her home and her family name. The only time Veronica had shown any real emotion toward Natalie was 2 months before the wedding, when Natalie had cautiously asked if there was anything she could help with in the preparations, and Veronica had looked at her with something that might have been pity or might have been disgust and said, "Just try not to make everything about you for once, okay? This is my day and I don't need you turning it into another opportunity for people to feel sorry for the poor orphan girl." The words had stung more than Natalie wanted to admit, had confirmed what she had always suspected, that her presence in the family was not just unappreciated, but actively resented, that Veronica saw her not as a sister, but as competition for attention and sympathy, as someone who took up space and resources that should have been exclusively Veronica's. Robert Sinclair woke up that same morning in his small 2-bedroom apartment in Cambridge, the rain drumming against the window of his bedroom in a steady rhythm that reminded him of Patricia's fingers on the piano keys, the way she used to play Chopin nocturnes on rainy Sunday mornings while he made coffee, and their daughter Abigail colored at the kitchen table, those perfect, ordinary moments that he had taken for granted when she was alive, and now missed with an ache that never quite went away no matter how much time passed. 3 years. It had been 3 years since the cancer had taken her. 3 years since he had stood at her bedside holding her hand and watching her slip away. 3 years since Abigail had asked him why Mommy was sleeping so much, and he'd had to explain in words a 4-year-old could understand that Mommy wasn't going to wake up this time, that she was going somewhere they couldn't follow, but that she loved them very much and would always be with them in their hearts. The grief had been overwhelming at first, consuming everything, making it hard to breathe or think or function, making the simple act of getting out of bed feel like climbing a mountain, making him wonder how he was supposed to raise a daughter alone when he could barely take care of himself. But he had done it, had forced himself to keep going because Abigail needed him, had learned to braid her hair and pack her lunches and help with homework and attend parent-teacher conferences, had become both mother and father as best he could, stumbling through the role but doing it anyway because the alternative was unacceptable. His job as an accountant at Brennan & Associates was stable and boring, and exactly what he needed, providing enough income to support them and enough routine to keep him grounded, though he knew his colleagues thought he was dull and overly serious, always declining invitations to happy hours and office parties, always rushing home to relieve the babysitter, always keeping his personal life separate from his professional one. The wedding invitation had come as a surprise, since he barely knew Matthew the groom, who worked in a different department and whom Robert had maybe exchanged a dozen words with over the past 2 years, but apparently the company culture demanded inviting everyone from the office. and so Robert had received a heavy, cream-colored envelope with elaborate calligraphy and a +1 that he had no intention of using. He had almost declined, had actually started to write out a polite excuse about family obligations, but then Abigail had found the invitation on his desk and had gotten excited about the idea of him going to a fancy party, had said with that earnest 7-year-old wisdom that sometimes hit too close to truth, "Daddy, you need to make new friends because you're always sad, and Mommy wouldn't want you to be sad forever." She had made him promise to go, had made him promise to talk to at least one new person, had made him promise to try to have fun, and he had agreed because saying no to Abigail's hopeful face was something he found himself increasingly unable to do. So that morning he put on his one good suit, the same suit he'd worn to Patricia's funeral, the same suit he wore to the handful of weddings and formal events he couldn't avoid, a department store purchase that fit well enough, but would never be mistaken for the designer clothing that the Whitfields and their circle wore with casual ease. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror as he tied his tie, seeing a 34-year-old man who looked older than his years, with lines around his eyes from too many sleepless nights, and grey threading through his dark hair earlier than it should have, with shoulders that seemed permanently slumped under the weight of responsibilities and losses, with eyes that Patricia used to say were kind but that now just looked tired. He thought about cancelling, about calling in sick and spending the day with Abigail instead, about avoiding the awkwardness of attending a wedding alone, where he knew almost no one. But he had promised his daughter, and Robert Sinclair was a man who kept his promises, even the ones that made him uncomfortable. The drive to the Whitfield estate took 40 minutes through rain-slicked streets, and he spent the time listening to NPR and thinking about nothing in particular, that kind of mental white noise that helped him get through difficult situations, a learned skill from the early days of grief when thinking too much about anything led to dangerous places. When he finally pulled into the circular driveway of the mansion, he was struck by the sheer scale of wealth on display, the manicured gardens and the fountain and the valets in matching uniforms, and the other guests arriving in luxury cars, and he felt immediately out of place, a working-class guy who had grown up in a triple-decker in Dorchester, crashing a party for people who summered in the Hamptons and wintered in Aspen. But he had promised Abigail, so he handed his keys to a valet who looked at his 10-year-old Honda with barely concealed disdain, and he walked into the ceremony venue with his head up and his shoulders back, determined to get through this afternoon and evening with his dignity intact. The ceremony itself was everything one would expect from a Whitfield production, excessive, elaborate, and engineered for maximum visual impact, with white roses covering every surface, with a string quartet playing Mozart, with 300 guests seated on white chairs with silk cushions, with Veronica descending the aisle in a dress that probably cost more than Robert's car, with the groom Matthew looking nervous but happy in his custom tuxedo, with readings from Rumi and Khalil Gibran delivered by hired actors with dramatic voices, with vows that had clearly been written by a professional rather than coming from the heart, with a kiss at the end that was more performance than passion, with applause that was polite rather than enthusiastic, with everything orchestrated and timed and perfect in that way that wealthy people seem to excel at, where money could buy beauty but not necessarily meaning, where grandeur could mask the absence of genuine emotion, where the performance of happiness became indistinguishable from actual happiness. And maybe that was the point. Maybe for people like the Whitfields, the performance was all that mattered, because it was what everyone else saw and judged and remembered. Robert sat in the back row on the groom's side, surrounded by people from the office who barely acknowledged him, listening to Margaret from accounting complain about her ex-husband and James from payroll boast about his golf handicap, feeling disconnected from it all, his mind drifting to Abigail and wondering what she was doing right now, probably playing with her friend Emma from next door, probably having more fun than he was having, probably not missing him at all, which was both reassuring and slightly sad in that way that parenting often was, watching your child become independent and being proud of it, while also mourning the baby who used to cling to your leg and cry when you left the room. He didn't notice Natalie during the ceremony, didn't see her sitting alone near the back on the bride's side, her beige dress making her fade into the background exactly as Eleanor had intended, her face composed in that careful neutral expression she had perfected over years of practice, showing nothing, revealing nothing, protecting herself through invisibility. It wasn't until the ceremony ended and guests began moving toward the reception hall that Robert caught his first glimpse of her, standing off to the side as the crowd flowed past her like water around a stone, as if she occupied a different space than everyone else, as if there was an invisible barrier that prevented anyone from getting too close or acknowledging her presence. Something about her stillness caught his attention. Something about the way she held herself with her spine straight and her chin up, despite being so obviously alone. Something about the sadness in her eyes that reminded him of his own reflection in the months after Patricia died, that look of someone going through motions and surviving but not quite living. He thought about approaching her, about fulfilling his promise to Abigail by introducing himself and making conversation, but the crowd carried him forward toward the reception hall and the moment passed, and he told himself there would be time later, not knowing yet how right that thought would turn out to be, not knowing that the universe sometimes arranges meetings that feel like coincidence, but are actually something more like fate or destiny, or whatever word you wanted to use for those moments when the right person appears at exactly the right time to do exactly what needs to be done. The reception hall was even more impressive than the ceremony venue, a massive space that had been transformed into something that belonged in a magazine spread about luxury weddings, with soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers that caught the light and threw rainbows across the room, with round tables covered in silk cloths and topped with centerpieces that were architectural works of art involving orchids and roses and branches and candles, with a head table on a raised platform where the wedding party would sit like royalty, surveying their kingdom, with a dance floor polished to a mirror shine, with a bar in one corner staffed by 3 bartenders in white jackets, with servers in black and white uniforms moving through the space with military precision, with everything designed to impress and intimidate and remind everyone present that this was not just a wedding, but a statement about the Whitfield family's place in Boston society, their wealth, their taste, their power to transform ordinary moments into extraordinary spectacles that people would talk about for years to come. Robert found his assigned table toward the back of the room, table 23, where his colleagues from the office were already gathering, and he settled into his chair and tried to look engaged as Margaret immediately launched into another complaint, this time about the traffic getting here, and how her GPS had taken her the wrong way, and how she'd almost been late because the valet line was so long, as if any of these minor inconveniences were worth discussing at length, as if anyone else at the table cared about her GPS or her punctuality or anything else about her day. Robert nodded at appropriate intervals and sipped his water and wondered how many more hours he would need to stay before he could politely excuse himself and go home to Abigail, go back to his real life, his ordinary life, his life that didn't include crystal chandeliers and champagne towers and ice sculptures shaped like swans. That's when he saw her again, Natalie, entering the reception hall with a place card in her hand and a look on her face that he recognized because he'd seen it before in the mirror during those dark months after Patricia died. The look of someone bracing themselves for pain, someone who knew what was coming and had no power to stop it, someone who had learned that hope was more dangerous than despair, because at least despair was predictable and couldn't disappoint you. He watched as she approached a waiter near the entrance, watched as the waiter pointed toward the far corner of the room, watched as her shoulders tensed and her face went carefully blank, watched as she started walking toward something that Robert couldn't yet see, something hidden behind a large potted palm tree that decorated the corner, something that became visible only when he leaned to the side and looked past the other tables and the servers and the clusters of guests mingling with champagne glasses. A folding table, the kind you bought at hardware stores for $10, the kind that belonged at yard sales and church potlucks and elementary school fundraisers, the kind that had no business being at a $500,000 wedding except as a statement, as a message, as a public humiliation disguised as accommodation. The table was set for one, with a paper tablecloth that clashed with the silk on every other table, with cheap flatware instead of the heavy silver everyone else had, with a single place setting that looked like an afterthought or an insult, or maybe both, with no centerpiece, no candles, no decoration of any kind, just the bare minimum required to technically say that yes, Natalie had been given a seat at her sister's wedding, even if that seat was deliberately chosen to announce to everyone present exactly what the Whitfields thought of her, exactly how much she mattered, exactly how little they valued her presence or her feelings, or her basic human dignity. Robert felt something shift inside his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, not since Patricia died, a feeling that was part anger and part recognition and part determination, a feeling that made him sit up straighter and pay attention in a way he hadn't been paying attention to anything for a long time, a feeling that reminded him of what Patricia used to say about standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, about using whatever privilege or power or voice you had to make things right, even when it was uncomfortable or inconvenient, or cost you something personally. He watched Natalie sit down at that folding table, watched her smooth her beige dress with hands that trembled slightly, watched her stare straight ahead at nothing and everything, watched her perform the kind of courage that most people would never recognize as courage because it was quiet and internal and involved nothing more dramatic than continuing to exist in a space that clearly didn't want you, continuing to take up space even when every message you received told you to disappear. The whispers started almost immediately, spreading through the reception hall like ripples on water, starting at the tables closest to Natalie's corner and expanding outward as guests noticed the folding table and its solitary occupant and began speculating about what it meant and why she was there and who she was, and what could possibly justify such bizarre seating arrangements at what was otherwise a meticulously planned event, where every detail had been considered and choreographed to perfection. Robert found himself eavesdropping shamelessly on the conversations happening at the tables around him, listening to strangers discuss Natalie like she was a puzzle to be solved or a scandal to be dissected, rather than a human being who could probably hear every word they were saying, if they'd bothered to lower their voices or consider that she had ears and feelings and a breaking point like everyone else. "That's the Whitfield's adopted daughter," a woman at the next table announced to her companions, her voice carrying easily in the pre-dinner lull, her tone suggesting that this explained everything, even though it actually explained nothing about why adopting someone meant you could treat them like a pariah at your other daughter's wedding. "The one with the missing arm," another voice added, as if this was relevant information, as if having one arm instead of two somehow justified being relegated to a corner like unwanted furniture, as if disability was contagious or shameful, or something that needed to be hidden away from polite society. "Can you believe Veronica actually invited her?" a third person chimed in. And Robert wanted to turn around and ask what exactly was so unbelievable about inviting your sister to your wedding. Wanted to point out that the unbelievable thing was not the invitation, but the treatment. Not the inclusion, but the exclusion disguised as inclusion. Not the presence, but the way that presence was being acknowledged and dismissed and degraded all at once. Instead, he stayed quiet and listened as the conversation continued, as the women at the next table traded observations and judgments and speculation with the casual cruelty that seemed to come naturally to people who had never been vulnerable or marginalized or forced to sit alone at a folding table while everyone else enjoyed silk and silver and the warm glow of belonging. "I mean, after everything the Whitfields did for that girl," one woman said, her voice dripping with implication, suggesting that gratitude was something Natalie owed perpetually, suggesting that being adopted meant surrendering your right to dignity or respect or equal treatment, suggesting that charity came with strings attached, and those strings could strangle you if you weren't careful. "Taking her in after that horrible accident, raising her like their own," another voice added, and Robert noticed the careful phrasing. Like their own, not as their own, that small linguistic distinction that revealed everything about how the Whitfields viewed Natalie's place in their family, how she was similar to but separate from, adjacent to but not quite part of, included but only conditionally, only provisionally, only as long as she knew her place and didn't ask for too much or expect too much or believe too much in the fiction of belonging. "Like their own," one of the other women repeated with a scoff that was somehow both bitter and amused. "Please, Linda, we all know why Harold really adopted her. His company was hemorrhaging money after those layoffs. Taking in a disabled orphan was the best PR move he ever made. turned him from villain to hero overnight. People have short memories when you give them something sympathetic to focus on instead. Robert's hand tightened around his water glass as he processed this information, as he understood for the first time the full context of what he was witnessing, as he realized that Natalie wasn't just being mistreated by her adoptive family, but had been used by them, exploited by them, turned into a prop in their public relations campaign, a human shield against criticism, a symbol that could be deployed whenever they needed to demonstrate their compassion and generosity to a skeptical world. The anger that had been simmering in his chest began to burn hotter, began to feel less like an emotion and more like a moral imperative, began to demand action rather than observation, began to push him toward a decision that he hadn't consciously made yet, but that was forming anyway, crystallizing out of his own grief and loneliness and understanding of what it meant to be alone in a room full of people, crystallizing out of the promise he'd made to Abigail about making a friend, crystallizing out of the memory of Patricia's voice in his head, saying what she always said when they encountered injustice or cruelty. "So what are you going to do about it, Robert? Are you going to look away, or are you going to do something?" The servers began bringing out the first course, some kind of soup in white bowls with gold rims, and Robert watched as they moved efficiently between tables, placing bowls in front of guests who barely noticed the service, who were too busy chatting and laughing and networking to acknowledge the people serving them, and he watched as a server approached Natalie's corner table with visible reluctance, placing a bowl in front of her with a mumbled apology that Robert couldn't hear but could read in the server's body language, in the way he ducked his head and hurried away, as if embarrassed by his role in this public humiliation, as if even the staff recognized that something fundamentally wrong was happening here, something that violated basic human decency, something that should not be happening at a celebration of love and family and commitment. Natalie picked up her spoon with her right hand, the only hand she had, and Robert realized he'd been staring, realized he'd been so focused on her that he'd completely ignored the soup that had been placed in front of him, realized that everyone at his table was looking at him with expressions ranging from confusion to concern. Margaret asking if he was feeling all right, James making some joke about the soup being safer than airplane food, the conversation continuing around him while he sat silent and separate, much like Natalie was sitting silent and separate in her corner, both of them alone despite being surrounded by people, both of them going through the motions of participating in an event that had no real place for them, both of them performing the role of guest while feeling like intruders. "Robert," Margaret's voice cut through his thoughts, sharper now, demanding attention. "Are you even listening? I was asking if you knew anything about the bride's family, the Whitfields. I've heard they're absolutely loaded. But there's some scandal there. Something about Harold Whitfield laying off a bunch of workers right before Christmas a few years back. Made the news and everything. People were protesting outside his office. It was quite the mess from what I understand, though obviously it all worked out fine for him in the end. These rich people always land on their feet, don't they? Must be nice to have that kind of cushion, that kind of safety net, not like the rest of us who have to actually worry about job security and mortgage payments and whether we can afford to send our kids to college." Robert nodded mechanically, making non-committal sounds that could pass for agreement or interest, while his mind was elsewhere, was still in that corner with Natalie, was still processing what he'd overheard about Harold Whitfield's adoption being a calculated PR move rather than an act of genuine compassion, was still feeling the weight of that revelation, and what it meant about the kind of people who would use a traumatized child as a tool for image rehabilitation, who would take someone vulnerable and broken and desperate for family and turn them into a performance piece, a before and after story for press releases and shareholder meetings, a way to demonstrate corporate social responsibility without actually having to be responsible to anyone but themselves and their bottom line. The soup was good, probably excellent actually, some kind of bisque with truffle oil, the kind of thing that would cost $30 at a restaurant, but Robert barely tasted it, barely noticed as he ate automatically, his body going through the familiar motions of dining while his mind remained fixed on the problem of Natalie, on the wrongness of her isolation, on the question of what, if anything, he could or should do about it, on whether doing nothing made him complicit in her mistreatment, on whether intervening would make things better or worse, on whether his daughter would be proud of him for standing up for someone or disappointed in him for causing a scene at someone else's wedding, on all the complex ethical calculations that seemed so much easier in theory than in practice, that seemed so straightforward when you were reading about injustice in the newspaper, but so much more complicated when you were sitting in the middle of it with 200 witnesses and social norms screaming at you to mind your own business and not make waves and let other people handle their own family matters. Patricia would have already done something, Robert thought. Patricia wouldn't have hesitated, wouldn't have worried about social conventions or making people uncomfortable, would have marched over to that corner and sat down at that folding table without asking permission or making a production of it, would have simply done what was right because the alternative was unthinkable to her, because she operated from a moral compass that pointed true north no matter what external pressures tried to pull it off course. But Patricia wasn't here, and Robert was alone with his uncertainty and his anger and his growing conviction that doing nothing was not actually an option, that watching injustice happen and not responding was itself a form of participation. That silence in the face of cruelty was its own kind of cruelty, that if he wanted to honor Patricia's memory and keep the promise he'd made to Abigail and look at himself in the mirror tomorrow without feeling like a coward, he was going to have to do something, even if that something was small and symbolic and probably wouldn't change anything in the long run, but might, just might, matter to one person in this moment, might make one person feel a little less alone, a little less invisible, a little less like the world had collectively decided they didn't matter. The decision, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic or sudden, but rather emerged gradually from Robert's internal debate, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, the image becoming clearer and clearer until there was no denying what it showed, no ambiguity about what needed to happen next, no more room for hesitation or second-guessing or the comfortable paralysis of overthinking that had become Robert's default mode in the years since Patricia died, since he'd lost his partner in moral courage and had to figure out how to navigate ethical dilemmas alone, without her fierce certainty to guide him, without her willingness to sacrifice social approval for doing what was right. He stood up during the transition between the soup course and the salad course, stood up while people were distracted and conversations were flowing and servers were moving through the aisles, collecting empty bowls, stood up in a way that felt both momentous and utterly ordinary, like stepping off a cliff or walking through a door, like the moment before everything changes even though nothing has changed yet except your intention, your commitment, your decision to act rather than observe, to participate rather than witness, to take a risk even though you don't know how it will turn out or what it will cost you, or whether anyone will understand or appreciate what you're trying to do. "Robert, where are you going?" Margaret's voice followed him as,